Okay, well, we can get started. Welcome everybody tonight. This is a webinar on behalf of the World Federation of Neurosurgical Society's Young Neurosurgeon Forum. Tonight we're talking with Dr. Roger Stupp about his paper, Radiotherapy plus Concomitant and Adjuvant Temozolomide for Glioblastoma, in addition to his presentation on being a medical researcher and path to research and kind of career planning. Dr. Stupp is an internationally recognized medical oncologist with a focus on innovative cancer treatments and drug development, particularly for brain tumors and brain metastases. At Northwestern, he leads the Division of Neuro-Oncology and serves as the co-director of the Malnati Brain Tumor Institute and associate director for the Laurie Comprehensive Cancer Center. He's been the lead investigator for numerous clinical trials, including outlining the protocols for temozolomide and radiation therapy for brain tumors, establishing MGMT as a predictive marker for benefit from alkylating agent chemotherapy, as well as investigating Optune as an innovative treatment modality. We're very excited to have you, Dr. Stupp, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for joining. It's my pleasure to be with you. And to be honest, I think that's part when I'm with the new generation, which gives me most pleasure and satisfaction. Let me see whether I can share the screen. So I'm not going to focus only on the paper, and we could have done that, and we can maybe do that another time with some of you. Start dissecting the paper, and you tell me why the paper is not good and what it's all about. So I really want to take you somewhat on a journey of the last 20 years or more in brain tumor research, and also kind of incite you to continue that journey as you advance your career. Let me get the right view. So, there's always potential conflict of interest. We make a big fuss of it. I don't think I have had any major financial implication. I would actually say sadly so, because otherwise we could fund a lot of more research. But as one of my friends once said, no conflict, no interest. And when you're in drug development, you can't do anything without the collaborations with industry and so on. So when I was starting in the field, in the late 1990s, and I wasn't coming from the neuro field. I really came from oncology and drug development, and we need to make progress. That was the kind of situation. I'm not exactly the size of the doctor here, but the fact that we never got 2 Christmas cards in a row from our patients with glioblastoma was really marked, and I think that's where we realized we have to do better. And sadly, Claude Serre, who actually, the cartoonist, died himself of a glioblastoma at some point, I don't know, 10 years after he made the cartoon. If you go back to the New England Journal, here in 2001, despite aggressive treatments, most patients die of disease. Median survival is not good, about 1 year, etc. Now, we had a new drug, a new kid on the block called temozolomide that was out there. It was not yet on the market. That was usually given for 5 days every 4 weeks based on mouse data. But coming from oncology, we also know that certain drugs have been developed one way, but they're not the best one. And it was actually Ed Newlands in the UK who developed the schema to give temozolomide daily for up to 7 weeks. Then again, what we've learned from oncology at that time, that was before all those sexy new targeted treatments, immunotherapy, that was all still a dream. We knew that when we joined modalities, we actually had improved outcome. That this was cervix cancer, it was esophageal cancer, it was head and neck cancer, to some extent lung cancer, combined modalities, so combining it with radiation. And that's how this schema, which you guys call the Stupp Protocol, has been developed when it took this phase 1 data of being able to give temozolomide on a daily schedule together with radiation. One thing which is also just philosophical, where you come from. As an oncologist, I believe that tumors do not distinguish between Saturday, Sunday, or holidays, while for the radiation oncologists, they very much think so, that the tumors do respect that, and that's why they don't treat on holidays and weekends. So the temozolomide is there. Whether this really matters or not is a different story. The other thing, which is medical oncology signature, it was 6 cycles of maintenance or adjuvant temozolomide, while when the prior schema that was developed, chemo was always given for 12 months or more. That's kind of the neurologist, as if something works, you would continue almost indefinitely. Not that one is right or one is wrong, but of course you come from a culture, how things are done, and from prior experience. So how did we really get started? And there was really a patient at the very beginning. I call her Noemi here. At the time, she was 25 years old, and she presented in January 1998 with what was called at the time GBM. We probably may call it differently today. And we figured, okay, what are you going to do with a 25-year-old? She was a student at the time, fully active. 12 months is really not good enough, and even if it's 15 months, it's not good enough. We had temozolomide in our hands for recurrent disease, and that's when we kind of worked on this schema to really come up and say, okay, let's get that into clinic. We wrote a protocol, got it approved, and then had her started within a month with temozolomide and radiation. She had tumor resection. All went fine, and then we also gave that first cycle of maintenance. And the idea again of the schema was, if I go back, you want to give enough drug. And so we felt that's maybe not enough. Only this is probably also not enough. So really give enough treatment. If that doesn't have an impact, we can move on and not work further on temozolomide. And you have to realize that at that time, temozolomide was not embraced, and the United States and the rest of the world was split between believers and non-believers. So we did that. Everything went well. She flew through the treatment, got the first cycle of maintenance, and did well. But at the time, as mentioned, she's a student, and she was actually studying in England. So I let her return to England. And we had the second cycle. And she gets the second cycle of temozolomide of the 5-day scheme. And she dropped her platelets to 8,000. Fortunately enough, the system was set up that although I had a physician ordering this CBC there and also following her, that I received a copy of the results. Trust me, I was fairly nervous when I knew her with a brain tumor walking around England with 8,000 platelet. I believe she had the blood drawn on a Wednesday. On a Thursday, we had the result, and I organized from far away a platelet transfusion. The following Wednesday, her local physician, GP, called her, something is not right with your blood counts, do you want to come in? So a week later, so by that time she had normalized, etc. So everything went well. Now I must say, if she would have bled, probably the Stupp protocol would never have happened. So you need a little bit of luck. You need to very carefully follow the patients early on. And that's another thing we saw, that while in our hands the schema went very well, there was a quite reputable institution in the United States who actually lost 2 or 3 patients on it early on, and they got me involved. Why? Honestly, I could not figure out why. Nothing they have done wrong, a little bit wrong patient selection, unlucky. So especially early on, if you get the toxicity for whatever reason or complications, you may not move forward with the treatment. Now, we then expanded this to a real multicenter trial. It was 2 institutions. It was Lausanne and Geneva, and we treated a total of 64 patients in a little bit under 3 years. And we got this kind of survival curve. And it was a median survival of 16 months. Now, what are you going to do with it? Very hard to say. You do something, what I have done, like you publish it, we even published it well in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, and you call it promising survival. If you're going to submit the paper to me nowadays and use exactly the same title for something new to come up, I'm not going to let that pass. Don't start saying promising, non-promising. I can only say this is the survival. We don't know whether this is selection bias. We don't have a control arm. Historical controls, I come back to this, is kind of a challenge. So keep that in mind and be self-critical. I knew I hadn't selected the patients. Again, this were coming from fairly small towns compared to big US institutions. We got all the patients we saw on the trial. So you need to really do it in a randomized fashion. And we did that very quickly afterwards together with EORTC and NCIC, so Cooperative group, where we really looked at temozolomide plus radiation versus radiation alone. And this was the outcome presented at ASCO in 2004 and then published in New England a few months later. The blue curve is the combo versus the red curve. Honestly, nothing to write home about. Still miserable, if we are very honest. So any one of you who is interested in doing a career in brain tumors, there is still a lot of improvements to be done. But the 2-year survival went up from 10% to 27% as a landmark analysis. So that was still meaningful. The patients who did well really did well. And overall, the regimen was reasonably well tolerated. So we have those few patients who had the thrombocytopenia, like the first patient I showed you, but this is under 10%. Now, again, under 10%, if you bleed and have a complication, that's enough. And if you're only 1 out of 10 who has complication, but it doesn't help you that 9 others have been doing well. So we have to keep that in. I think the other thing what we've learned and done here is we have collected all the tumor tissue blocks and slides, not only for pathology review, that was a critical part at the time, but also we looked at MGMT. And in the same issue of the New England, we were able to publish and demonstrate that when you have an MGMT gene promoter methylation, that the MGMT, the repair protein expression, is inactivated, is silenced, and so the main damage induced by temozolomide could not be repaired. That's where you get the difference. And this is this upper panel here, where you see the majority of the benefit is for the MGMT methylated, while actually for the unmethylated, there is no true benefit. Yes, the blue curves looks a little better than the red one, but it's not, if it's maybe even if it's statistically significant, it's not necessarily meaningful. And you have to realize that no test is 100%, and there may also be some cross-contamination. It's intent to treat. So we have in the unmethylated one, we had an ependymoma that was in there that was misdiagnosed, but it's reported that way. So based on this, already in 2005, 2006, we proposed that you need a different strategy for methylated and unmethylated ones. And you can see that this is kind of an old slide when the slides were still rectangular. Here now they're before the widescreen, that I really separated the two and said, okay, for the ones who are methylated, temozolomide will stay. But for the ones who are unmethylated, where the benefit is only marginal, we could actually consider omitting temozolomide towards something new and not yet proven to be ineffective. So that was part of the rationale. It took almost 10 years until the field really accepted that approach. But at some point, when you want to make an improvement, you also have to get rid of things that do not really work. or only work marginally. To give you examples of this, that this can be done, I'll just show you a few examples. But before I go to that, we need to understand a little bit what methylated, unmethylated means. Yes, it is a black and white test, but the cutoff is not absolutely clear when you have this bimodal distribution. And you look here in an exponential graph, if you just take the median cutoff, that may be the few that are methylated that should still be in or not. So depending how you want to enrich your population, you need to make the cutoff different. If you want to withhold temozolomide and not give it, then you need to have a way more conservative cutoff for calling it unmethylated. And if it's the opposite, you want to enrich for the methylated one, you need a different cutoff. And there is a gray zone in between where you cannot necessarily make a decision. Now, that's not how the tests are usually reported. And for some reason, we think in every medical center in the basement, we have to reinvent the test rather than validate it. And we had validated the one test that is formally commercially available. Not that it's the best one, but it's the most validated one. And it takes a little more understanding. And I could give you examples by not understanding this that you may actually be detrimental by withholding temozolomide. Nevertheless, we and others have done trials where we looked at only methylated ones. These are just 3 examples. That's one out of my cuisine. Not every trial Dr. Stupp does is positive. Here I show the hazard ratio of 1.0. So the experiment works perfectly, randomization works, but no effect. That was the selengitide. There is, we're waiting a trial with a PARP inhibitor, Recurrent, that has been done within the Alliance Cooperative Group Network in the United States. And there's most recently a trial from Germany where they combined lomustine and temozolomide. And it didn't show a difference in progression-free survival. Had suggested a difference in overall survival, but what they did, they massaged the data from the upfront. They said, we're going to use a stratified log rank test. We don't use all the patients, just look at the numbers, how they go down. It's been 50 in one, 49 in one group and 60 in the other, or 68 and 57. But if you go in the supplement and you look at true intent to treat, there is no difference in outcome. Now, there may still be an effect. It may be rational. Germany, the trial is coming from Germany, has adapted this as the new standard, but overall it's not accepted as a new standard. It has more toxicity. It has its own limitations, but it's feasible. So within the US Energy Cooperative Group Network, we'll try to repeat and confirm this. The trial was completely underpowered. This has to do with the realities when funding is not appropriate, and when you want to do trials in the academic setting, you often don't have the funding needed to do the trial appropriately. So it's not necessarily the PI to blame, then the system itself. The same PI has done a trial for non-methylated patients, and where he gave, instead of temozolomide, he gave bevacizumab and irinotecan, and you show no difference. But also, it also shows you, if you do it right, you can withhold temozolomide in the unmethylated ones, and you're not detrimental. So that's kind of part 1. Again, if you want to interrupt, just turn your camera on, and then we'll see you, and we can take questions. Now, what else have we been doing and are we doing in advances? A lot is in molecular biology, in understanding the biology of the disease, whether it's gene expression, whether this is epigenetics, whether this is new classifications, understanding what genes are upregulated and or not. And the hope is, with this better understanding, it will also allow for more individualized treatments, novel treatments, more rational treatments than just giving alkylating agents to everybody. One of those markers, and I just keep it for the sake of the audience we have today, simple, just the IDH mutation. Again, something that we didn't know about in 2000 when we did our temozolomide trials. That came out in 2008, 2009, IDH mutation. We realized that IDH mutation is not only a hallmark of secondary gliomas, that means lower grade gliomas that transform, but they have intrinsically a better prognosis and a different outcome. It's a different disease. And and as of this year, there is no more IDH mutated glioblastoma. It's going to call astrocytoma grade 4 IDH mutated. It's completely separate. So knowing that these markers have an influence. And as of this summer, the book is not yet out, but the papers are out. We have a new WHO classification, which now makes it mandatory that you have molecular understanding and molecular biology and markers in the diagnostics, not only looking down the microscope. And that's a major change as we move into the new decade, that we really reflect in the classification how we name and call tumors with the molecular pathology. And one of the challenges is, depending where you work, you may not be at the medical center that has its own neuropathology at the level we need, because it's just not enough volume to warrant an expert and a neuropathologist or even a team of neuropathologists. So most of the time when we see patients from the outside, I have to start and will start with pathology review. And I did that many years ago, and I did that even when I was in Europe, and I remember a patient has been referred to us with a glioblastoma, and on path review, it was a medulloblastoma, and the medulloblastoma we could, with adequate treatment, subsequently cure, and the patient is 20 years later still coming for regular follow-up. So it's crucially important that we have the interaction with the pathologist. Pathologists need to be, you need to know them, you need to discuss with them the cases, they need to understand the clinical side if you really want to have impact. Now, with this new classification, you all of a sudden have the same name, but it's not the same thing anymore. So what we're going to call in 2021, 2022 is a glioblastoma is probably not exactly the same composition of glioblastoma than we had in our 2005 paper. And if I go on the new classifications, I said the IDH mutated tumors, they are out. So some very good prognosis one, some very poor prognosis one, like the midline glioma, are out as well. But we have what we called molecular GBM. So not necessarily even a contrast enhancing tumor, but with molecular features of a glioblastoma that will be called GBM. So I say this just to warn from historical comparisons. So historical comparisons may not work in the future anymore as well. Now there's a nice paper in the New England that calls this the Will Rogers phenomenon, and was kind of with the joke when the Okies left Oklahoma for California, the IQ was increasing in both states. So if you want to read this paper, the reference is here. It's worth just to understand. And I more want to just highlight that there are biases, that we do comparisons. And when people like me even declare from the stage X or Y seems to be better in historical controls, just have a critical mind, okay? Because you don't always know what's in there. So what else do we have? We need to be a little bit creative. So I need to quickly talk about tumor treating fields, alternating electrical fields. Now, even though I had the privilege to be involved since 2005 with the development of this, really the credit goes to Yoram Palti, who is a physician and physicist at the Technion in Haifa, who observed and had this, okay, these electrical fields may interfere with biological processes. And then showed it that when you have an electrical field, all the organelles, all the molecules in our body that are somewhat charged will orient themselves according to the charge. Now, if you start changing the electrical fields every so often, the molecules will have to adapt. Now, if you do that at a specific frequency, ongoing, you will ultimately disrupt cell division. And that's observations that were made in the early 2000s with numerous preclinical experiments. We have now also work that has been done after 2000, after the early works, and really showing, yes, it can be automitotic. It may interfere with DNA repair. It will induce autophagy. It will ultimately also induce apoptosis. It may have an anti-migratory effect, and there is even some immunogenic effect. Now, if you're going to ask me which one is the predominant effect, I can't tell you which one is the predominant one. As we move on, we learn. But that ultimately it's apoptosis. This could be clearly shown in a series of experiments. This is just the immunogenic effect showing on a rabbit model in the lung that you have a higher infiltration of immune cells, of lymphocytes when the lung is exposed to tumor-treating fields. I see a camera going on. Is that a question?
No. Okay.
You can have the cameras on. It just it's one way to kind of manifest this. So the mode of action, and that's, as for anything I tell you, kind of the current state of the error is really on the focus on the spindle apparatus, and we know that the spindle apparatus as a target actually is for the Wnt alkaloids, for the taxanes. So that's a very fundamental process that we can target in cancer. And when we have this spindle fibers all of disrupted, we ultimately get aneuploidy, we get the disruption of cell division as one mechanism as we induce apoptosis and apoptotic cell death. Now you have a new mechanism of action of an anti-cancer treatment, but does that make sense? Cancer usually is a systemic disease. It's not a local disease. Actually, glioma is an exception to the rule. We usually don't have metastatic disease, and it's confined to the brain or the central nervous system. So it was one good example to study this modality, whether it may have any clinical use. There are other, like mesothelioma, pancreatic adenocarcinoma, ovarian cancer, where local control can be important. How was that done, and how was it developed? Basically, to have four arrays of 9 electrodes affixed to the shaved skull, and that linked to a portable device that is now about 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms, battery powered, and that's a 24/7 treatment. So that's fine. You can apply. You could calculate that you really can build the fields through the skull, which of course is not as trivial as it seems. Now, how do you test this? Now, when we test new treatments in glioma, we often start in recurrent disease. And that's probably wrong. The recurrent disease works well to show feasibility, to show safety, But so far in glioma, even temozolomide by itself would have failed in drug development for recurrent disease. So when you want to treat in glioma and you want to show efficacy, it is probably better to take it up front. So early on, I have been pushing for doing an upfront trial. And fortunately, we had started the upfront trial before the conclusion of the recurrent trial. Otherwise, it may never have happened. And that's the recurrent trial, where we had best physician's choice. The reason it's best physician's choice instead of saying what we want is recurrent glioblastoma. If you take 2 experts, you get at least 3 opinions. And if you take 3 experts, you get at least 5 opinions. And even Dr. Stupp's opinion may differ on Monday, fresh, or on a Friday, tired. So we have to realize that. And it was a randomized trial, reasonably sized, 240 patients, and no true difference. This was first, second, third recurrence. Yet, we look at the response rate, and that was the response rate reviewed by radiologists. Look how miserable the response rate was with best physician's choice, around 6%. We got 12% with the tumor treating fields. Whatever that means, but it seems that this device, even by itself, had some effect. Ideally, if I would have to redesign this trial, I would say best physician's choice plus or minus tumor treating fields. But you can't do that because depending on the physician's choice, the FDA or the regulator may ask that for each combo you show first a safety trial that this can be done. Now, suffice to say, there is no overlapping toxicity. Toxicity is only to the skin and locally, that we don't have any issues with toxicity. If we have issues, it's really the lack of efficacy. And then we did it in the upfront setting. And in the upfront setting, the results came out, the final results in 2017. Let me just show you how the trial was done, a 2-to-1 randomization. 2/3 got tumor treating fields, 1/3 got only the maintenance temozolomide. Randomization was after the end of chemoradiation. So if we get 21 months now here, this is 21 months from randomization. So you can add 3 and 4 months more since the surgery. However, the worst patients, the 10% of patients who usually will progress and do poorly during radiation and chemotherapy are not included. So you can't say, oh, now this is 25 months compared to Dr. Stupp's formerly 15 months, because again, it's not the same patient selection, but you need to keep in mind that the randomization was at a later stage. That's the outcome. Progression-free survival improved, overall survival improved, consistently improved. Remember when I talked about the German trial with CCNU and temozolomide, progression-free survival was not improved and only overall survival. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a significance for each parameter, but you want at least a consistent theme of result to be halfway convinced that this is an effect. And the hazard ratio is 0.63, so just exactly the same hazard ratio than for temozolomide. So some people say the benefit is marginal. I would agree with that, but the benefit is marginal for temozolomide. The benefit is marginal for radiation, for everything we do. But altogether, on the right patients, we have patients who now live 5 years and longer. That's the long-term survival, what you hear. So at 3 years, 26% compared to 16%. Not great, but better. Again, if you ask the company, and if you look from the company, it will tell you at 5 years, it's 5% versus 13%. I don't fully buy this because an industry-sponsored trial, once the main result was seen, follow-up of these patients was not continued. So it's a little more speculative. We don't have enough follow-up on the majority of patients to make a statement on the very long survival. I mentioned skin reactions. That's what you can see. When we grade things, it's all about the grade 2, but of course, a chronic grade 2 can actually still not be very nice and easy to tolerate. Yet, we usually can handle the side effects. For a hardcore oncologist like me, this is nothing compared to what we have seen before with chemotherapy. Quality of life, what we do, we really do it for quality of life. And rather than going into sophisticated quality of life analysis, this gentleman is skiing in the Canadian Rockies. Of course, it's kind of his heating cap on with the Optune device. And this is a student, a patient of mine, and I'm way more worried on the motorcycle than of her glioma. And she's now going for 5 or 6 years. How are you doing? Still have energy?
Yes, sir.
So how can we move forward, and how do things happen? Translational research. The mouse we have cured, and it takes so long until we have an impact on humans. So why that? We are not mice. Whenever I talk with my lab colleagues, they said the mouse now lives 60 days instead of 30 days. I said, maybe the mouse should be cured before I take it to the human. And I think on diseases like glioblastoma, we should move things quickly to the human test rather than spending 5 years on the perfect mouse model. Mouse model is a model to understand mechanisms, but not necessarily to have a clear idea on the efficacy. We need to see where we set the bar. Sometimes we put the bar too low. Exactly. The mouse, 45 days or 60 days instead of 45 days, maybe that's not good enough to move into a large trial. I think we need to pay more attention in the early phase. Often this is all underfunded, and academically, as I said, a few mice experiments, even nicely done, and then move to the clinic and rapidly into pivotal trials. We need to do more on the biomarker side, understanding, early readout, imaging, target engagement. It's easy to say, it's way more difficult to do, and even for most treatments we don't have good biomarkers. But I think here we need to become smarter, so we really take only the trials into pivotal trials that have a real chance to have an effect. I think for the ones of you who work in the lab, be self-critical. Avoid the word promising, I mentioned that before. Look at outliers. If you have patients, what we sometimes do in the lab, this must be something went wrong. But in the clinic, if you have patients who do differently and do better than you would predict, you wonder what it is. And often we now find out, many of our glioblastoma who were doing better, we find out that these were IDH mutated tumors, things we just didn't recognize at the time, we didn't know about. I think team up with others and stop repeating the same experiment over and over again. And if you think that I exaggerate, then this was just, I did that once, I looked it up on the trials they were there. There's so many trials. Many of those I could look up and could say they're more or less of the same target, the same principle, or the trials, because they have no control arm, you can't learn anything. Or the same thing is done by several institutions. How many phase 2 trials do we have with a checkpoint inhibitor in brain tumors? You already know it's not working. At least it's not working the way we're doing it today. So we should not repeat the same thing all over again. We probably need to collaborate.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, please go ahead.
I can also stop here. The last little vignette is targeted therapies. These molecular aberrations we now have targeted agents that could work. And I just give you one example. It's rare. We have, it's only about 5% of glioma that we have a target that could really be targeted. But we sometimes find also in the pilocytic astrocytoma BRAF mutations. And we have, because the BRAF mutations are common in melanoma, we have BRAF inhibitors, the BRAF MEK combination inhibitors. And that works usually very nicely. The trouble with the targeted agent often is that they acquire resistance and the effect is temporary, but it's there. Yet, we don't always know which is the driver mutation. And let me illustrate that with this kind of pathway. And you're going to try to look carefully to understand what this pathway is, and I'm not sure anybody recognizes it. But it looks pretty much what you often see in the lab. Actually, this pathway is the train map of Tokyo. So that's all the subway and train. Now, if you want to have control that no traffic is going from the east to the west or from the north to the south, just blocking one line will not suffice. You need to find the key train stations that you need to block to really have an effect. So there is always multiple pathways and multiple alternative ways that the signal can go. So similar, when traffic is backed up in your city, you find little ways to nevertheless make it to the other part. Last but not least, blood-brain barrier. Another just vignette for the future, and I just show that so at some point you invite me back so I can show some of the newer things we're doing. Blood-brain barrier you know about, you've heard about, and actually it's there so our drugs don't cross. And I could give a whole lecture of big trials we have done by smart people, myself and others, with drugs that we actually knew that they will not cross the blood-brain barrier. That's just 3 examples of drugs that have been used. So drug delivery is an issue. And there is a whole group of investigators looking at better drug delivery. One example, and it's coming out of our Northwestern team, is looking at gold nanoparticles. And Alex Steig and Priya Kumtekar have done a phase 0 trial, so a non-therapeutic trial, with a very small amount of gold nanoparticles that are loaded with spherical nucleic acids that would downregulate MYC. So this has been published earlier this year, and what they could show that they could find the gold nanoparticles in the tumor tissue when they operated. So this was given before the surgery for recurrent tumors. So we knew the patient had a recurrent glioblastoma, and we gave it a few days earlier. And we could detect and demonstrate the gold. We could actually detect, so on magnification, that's the nucleus, that it is actually in the cytosol. Suggestive that actually with the gold, we selectively get into the tumor. Now, even nanograms of gold is quite expensive, so it's not something you can easily scale up, but at least as a principle, how nanomedicine could help for better drug delivery and as a carrier to bring antisense molecules or something else to the tumor as one way to better overcome the blood-brain barrier. Another way is ultrasound, and there are different ways of doing that. And I just want to show you one principle we've been working with, and that has been coming from France, where they used ultrasound. It's a grid. This grid of 9 ultrasound emitters. Initial trial was done with only 1 emitter that is implanted into the skull, and the ultrasound is activated at the time when we give the chemotherapy. Just to give you, because you're neurosurgeons, a few views out of the operating room. I'm not doing the surgery. I'm, again, a medical oncologist, but this is Adam Sonnabend and the team who do that. Now, quite frequently, you take a little bit of skull out, this is going to stay. This is under the skin. Here we can afterwards access the device with an external generator. He can demonstrate intraoperatively how the blood-brain barrier opens by using fluorescent, and could show that, I can't show you the full movie, that it would not fluoresce before you use the ultrasound, and you see how the fluorescent would diffuse. So that's just a 3D view how it looks like when it is implanted. And here you see that's on a patient after tumor resection, presonication. We activate the ultrasound. We give microbubbles IV that will be activated through the ultrasound over 2.5 or 3 minutes. We go into another MRI, reschedule. You could really see all of a sudden. So this is a few hours apart how you could almost see where the ultrasound was active. That can go all the way to the contralateral side. That's an indirect measure that we open the blood-brain barrier. Now, the next step is not just an indirect measure. We want to know how much of the drug gets into. So we do it intraoperatively and look both at tissue that needs to come out that is contrast enhancing, but also out at peritumoral brain that is not contrast enhancing, and look at drug levels, and could see that the drug levels are several folds increased with the ultrasound. Different work from Matt Lesniak, again, it's Northwestern work, and made the cover page of Lancet Oncology in August, which is oncolytic virus, an oncolytic virus that is genetically modified with a survivin promoter that gets activated with the radiation. It's a phase 1 trial, so it was basically a safety trial, so we should not overread too much into it, but it could be safely done. And at least when you look at the few patients who were unmethylated, they seem to have a survival that was, now I say again, saying it is different than writing it, maybe encouraging to want to go further on the concept. We could show that you have an increase in T cells and infiltration of T cells in the tumor, but also increase in the peripheral blood. That's what I meant with the methylated, non-methylated tumors with their survival curve. But the numbers are extremely small, so I would not overread it. So let me close just to say, I think if you want to have an impact, we need to collaborate interdisciplinary. So our team, in the med-onc, we have neuro-oncs, we have epileptologists, we have neurosurgeons with different expertise. We have 7, 8 labs. We're privileged because we all more or less under the same roof, so we can interact. And especially before COVID, that was easy because you would run into each other, you would have lunch together. We still do some of this on Zoom the best we can. You need collaborators. You work closely. In my career, it was Monica Higgi at the time when I teamed up with temozolomide in the lab. And she was the first author and very important for all the MGMT work we have done. And that's Lausanne and the mountains, just to make you jealous how beautiful it can be when you do research. That's the view out of Monica's office. My office, at the time, was in the basement. You know, the oncologists, you don't want to see them, so we were hidden in the basement. The cooperative group, as I've done that in Europe, that was the EORTC for the phase 3 trials. I think it takes all those parts, neuropathology, neuroimaging, all integrated from 2, maybe 3 modalities. When I started, we now have 5 modalities. We have targeted therapies, we have immunotherapy on the horizon, we have tumor treating fields established. So things have changed clearly. This is just to show you how impressive the team is. This is my most difficult slide, because this slide I should almost every month change and adapt and add new heads on, and I don't know how to put them anymore, because we're growing and we have a dynamic team with new people, new ideas. And when I told you, I have a pleasure to interact with you. Yes, be independent thinkers, and no, don't do what I say. Do it better. Come up, challenge us, and then we can make progress. At the end, our patients are waiting for better treatments. With that, I close, and I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Stupp. That was a great overview of the treatment and research areas for tumors that I know we're all very much too familiar with. I especially appreciate your comments on the need to be cognizant of the limitations of retrospective analysis of data, particularly, this is a rapidly developing field. And so I think, as you mentioned, it's very hard to do kind of prospective studies with these patients because we're always trying to do what people think are the best therapies. And so, of course, retrospective analysis is what we kind of rely on. But as things are changing with the molecular analyses and naming and understanding of these tumors, it's becoming more and more challenging. We'd like to open it up to the floor for anyone to ask questions if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask.
Hello, I have a question here. Hello, Dr. Stupp. I'm Elizabeth Ogando. I'm a postdoc here at the University of Florida, and I'm working in immunotherapy. So I have a question regarding the immunotherapies and adopted T-cell therapies. What would you think about the new adjuvant versus the adjuvant therapies after the standard of care?
If I understood correctly, you asked for the neoadjuvant.
Correct.
The neoadjuvant would mean even before surgery.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good concept. I think we can learn a lot from it. The challenge is you can't always wait. It would mean you need a biopsy before. So it's more practical challenges. It's also, if you tell a patient, you have a tumor, I could take it out, but I propose to you that we do a clinical trial and we take it out in 2 months. It just doesn't fly that easily. But we are trying to do such a trial. We had one on the horizon. I know that my colleagues in England have just launched a trial prior to it. I can tell you we try to do it, or we've done it for some patients with temozolomide. I published it, but at least with temozolomide, we didn't see any good result. So the sequencing may play a role, but it's more for what we can learn. We could basically check in vivo what we do and could identify the patients who benefit, which is fair enough to do. And then I was not sure that the timing matters that much. But the results from UCLA, where actually a little bit of pembrolizumab before repeat surgery presumably does better. But I needed always 500, 600, 700 patients on the trials to show a benefit, and apparently there was 15 and 19 patients in each arm, so that could be just a selection bias. But the translational results were very informative and very good.
Okay. And what would you think? Just another question based on what you said, because neoadjuvant will be before the surgery. I just have this question here. What about if would you think it will be feasible or will be worth to do any type of immunotherapy after surgery before chemo and radiotherapy? Just to avoid the immunosuppressed environment that it might give us. I mean, just at that.
So
I don't know.
Yes or no. It's the same problem there as well. Or at least you have the tumor bulk out, so that could help, but there's the healing. At some point, either you have a very good rationale Otherwise, you're going against what is commonly done. So the key when I started with temozolomide, I let my radiation oncology colleagues do what they have always been doing. The surgeons could do whatever. If I would have had to say you should do or you should delay your treatment, they would have given me a hard time. I could never have done it for practical reasons.
Yeah.
Now, what you're mentioning is very important. Be cognizant, less steroids is better. Depending where a patient gets treated, they still are discharged with way too many steroids for too long of time.
Sure.
And then, of course, immunotherapy doesn't make any sense. You don't drive your car with one foot on the accelerator and the other one on the brakes.
Yeah. All right.
But you could switch to temozolomide during radiation to the 5-day instead of the continuous, which is less immunosuppressive.
Yeah.
I think that could be a way to overcome it. And if you take the German data with the CCNU, that's what they did. And it didn't, at least it wasn't worse either. So that could well be the case.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Do we have someone else with a question? I see a raised hand here.
Thank you very much. My name is Beverly Chesram. I'm calling from Nairobi. I think my question was, thank you first of all, Prof. Stupp, about brilliant masterclass. The first question I have is, and apologies if you've already covered this, utilizing viral vectors in treating gliomas and other intracranial tumors. What are your thoughts? The second is, one of the challenges of many of the protocols is that they require quite a lot of resourcing in terms of manpower, patient coming to specialized centers. Where do you think there may be room for us to develop therapies that allow more care to be done in the home setting, rather than requiring necessarily to have a greater oncological supercenter involvement?
So let me start with the second question. We need to separate. When we work on developing new treatments, this is high check. Money doesn't play a role, access not, resources, to show a principle. And that was true for temozolomide at the time as well. But once we establish a treatment, we know how it works, I think we can de-escalate and it can be rolled out larger. Because I would fully agree with you, if the treatment is not accessible, we haven't done anything. The same thing when people say, oh, we work for drug companies or with drug companies. If nobody is marketing it afterwards, it doesn't help. So we need to separate that. But of course, if I go with viruses, high check, I need to do the translation, I need to follow up. That's a complete different ballpark. And that's probably not the daily worries you have in Nairobi. And it's not the daily worry you have in many parts of the United States, even in the big cities. So it's not everybody has the privilege to come to one of those big centers. But temozolomide is the best example. Once it was established, it's been routine care, and it's not rocket science, and you don't have to be super smart to prescribe the Stupp Protocol. Still, I think radiation is still the bigger challenge, because that needs a machine. The machine needs to be functional. We all say radiation, but the radiation treatment fields vary greatly among centers, so there is a lot to do there as well. To the viruses, I think it's a different way of drug delivery, and I think what I forgot to say when I talked about our oncolytic virus, I showed you, is actually linked to neural stem cells. It's not only modified, it's not only given up front, but it's linked to neural stem cells. So the rationale behind is that you have a way better distribution. So it's a different way to overcome the very local setting to a regional setting. Tumor treating fields is regional. And I think that's because that's one of the challenges. It's not a disease that metastasizes, but I need to treat larger parts of the brain. I think it's among the more important and interesting. It changes the microenvironment. Changes of the microenvironment may be combined with the immunotherapy, holds promise. I'm only careful usually because everything holds promise, but how much then delivers is a different story. And it took, even in melanoma, 25, 30 years until finally immunotherapy worked in some patients, and we still don't have the perfect biomarkers. On the other side, we have a biomarker for temozolomide called NGMT, but we still give it to everybody because we don't have anything better for the ones who are unmethylated. So I hear you. So I think your challenges are different than when we try to develop new treatments. But yeah, it's different problems, differently to approach it. You can also argue, there's so many basic needs to be solved. How much life years do we gain when we put resources in glioblastoma treatment compared to maybe cardiovascular? So we're going to be philosophical. Megan, that's the next topic you can do.
Absolutely.
How to use our
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, resource utilization and management are always a huge topic for our group, of course, being transcontinental and representing all sorts of hospitals and institutions and resources. Dr. Stupp, I'd like to actually touch back on the kind of the last portion that you mentioned, the collaboration and the group efforts. Can you talk a little bit about how you established your team? You clearly have a lot of experience in transcontinental teamwork as well, and working with people outside of your institution. And can you talk about how you kind of integrated everyone and how you set up the team and organized and met and that kind of thing? That's something that we always work towards with our YNF group and WFNS, and of course neurosurgery as a whole is becoming much more globally focused.
No easy answer. It's a fine balance between the egos, and I was lucky to be able to carry the flag, but you need to not forget it's not a single person doing it. It's all together. I would wish our universities would recognize a little more collaborative work. And you always ask how many, first author papers, but maybe it's better to be in a Nature, Science, or New England paper in the middle that changes the world than having a few mice that you killed yourself. I think I'm hopeful that at least some of you and the new generation are having the internal drive. I can only go from my personal experience. I never meant to make a career out of it. It really came from this one case or similar cases. I took the energy from the patients. There was no plan. If you would have asked me in the 1990s whether I want to be a professor and all of that, I would have said no, never. So it's not what you taught. Normally you are told you should have a clear career plan and you need to have that. You have to have so many papers so you get into the residency program and afterwards the promotion. Life is too short. Do it with a passion, and a little bit of luck is needed. The same thing. Let's be very honest. If temozolomide would not have worked, I would be nowhere. I married to have done the right trials and got that through against all odds, but the effect of the treatment itself, somebody else has invented a treatment. The same is true for tumor treating. Be open in your mindset. People always ask, how did you know? I said, I have no clue. Why do you know tumor treating field is working? I said, I'm still skeptical, even now. But the data is the data. I think go open-minded at things. That's the best I can tell you. I would wish I had a recipe. Or maybe out of this forum, you have a few people who identify questions that they think is important and interesting. Maybe the last thing, I probably spent a lot of time each time was authorship on the papers. And I had large spreadsheets, also when there more than one paper coming out, who merits what, etc., to make sure you give back to everybody a little bit as much as you can. Not always done. There are publications out there with people on the paper who have never treated the patient themselves and never recruited the patient on a trial, just because they're so-and-so.
Absolutely. We definitely appreciate that advice. YNF is essentially comprises of all young and early career neurosurgeons and people interested in neuro-oncology and these sorts of patients. So that is very important advice to follow. It looks like we have a question in the chat. Somebody asked, what do you suggest for low-grade gliomas operated on, it looks like, without gross total resection that aren't radiated? Do you have any recommendation for regimens of RT and temozolomide for these sorts of situations?
So low-grade glioma is a completely different ballpark, because there you have to make sure you don't do any damage. While in the grade 4s, I could not lose much. We can also overtreat, we can have side effects, and so on. It is more than one fits it all. If I look at the data, overall, the data suggests that chemotherapy seems to have an impact, so use it earlier rather than later. The radiation oncologist will tell you radiation also needs to be part of it. I would put a question mark on, because radiation has been out there. We don't have a trial looking at the role of radiation, the timing of radiation. We had one trial from the EORTC from the 1980s, where actually delaying radiation was not detrimental. The chemo we have is not very good. That's the challenge. I can refer you, if you look at the paper we published 2 years ago or 3 years ago in Lancet Oncology, first author Baumert, I'm the last author, on temozolomide versus radiation in true grade 2 low-grade glioma, what we call high-risk low-grade glioma. You only have progression-free survival data, and it didn't matter whether we gave temozolomide or we gave radiation. The trial was really conceived not to show that one is better than the other, but it was a way that I tried to find answers in the translational part to identify on a molecular level who needs a more aggressive treatment, and who are the ones who will do well with very little care and treatment over 20 years. I don't have the answers for that, but we know we have some markers like CDKN2A and others on a molecular level that's suggestive that they have a worse prognosis and may need a more intensive treatment. Oligodendroglioma is completely separate nowadays. And here we always argue between my colleagues and myself. For an oligodendroglioma, I would give temozolomide and not radiation often, especially in patients who are a little on the younger side, while others say, no, we give radiation plus chemotherapy. Honestly, these are the most complex patients, because nowhere you have real good data you can base yourself. When we try to withhold radiation and say, I want to give something else, sometimes a short course of radiation for a very focal tumor may be actually easier and less detrimental than a year of chemotherapy, whether it is PCV or temozolomide. So, and if you look at the reports, we're not very good. We often don't report the size. We often don't report location. We haven't done a good job altogether. So that's all factors to consider. And I'll welcome you. I invite you as soon as we're allowed to travel and have guests again. Spend a week or two with me in clinic, and you'll see how we try to handle it and individualize the approach to the patient. I usually start also ask the patient what he does professionally. If you have somebody with a very intellectual background, you want to be more careful with the radiation because that's their life. Well, if you have a patient who has a more physical background, so it's important that they are otherwise well and physically well. So a little bit the cognitive decline may have less impact on their quality of life.
Absolutely. Is there anybody else who would like to unmute and ask any questions? Give it a moment. It looks like we're wrapping up here. Dr. Stupp, we really appreciate your time and spending time with us this evening. This was a fantastic talk. We have it all recorded, so it'll be uploaded on the YNF website that's on YouTube, our YouTube channel, within the next week or so, and we'll send that out to everybody. And we really appreciate you being here with us this evening.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure meeting you all, albeit virtual. And whenever our paths cross, make yourself understood and say hello. Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good evening.